Tonight on Cross Currents, Fugitives in Africa, the tragedy of millions of refugees who wander this vast continent. Driven from their homes by war, disease, and hunger, they search for peace and the hope of a better life somewhere. Cross Currents with Jim Carney.
Refugee. Surely one of the most evocative words in our language. Yet the images it evokes change remarkably over time. After the Second World War, it applied primarily to Europeans displaced by the war, then the Palestinians. In the 60s and 70s, one thought of Asians, Vietnamese, Cambodians. But then, there were obvious reasons why these people were refugees, and everyone knew it was a temporary condition. But something frightening is happening in Africa. Of the more than 10 million refugees in the world today, more than half of them are in Africa, and their numbers continue to rise. One estimate predicts between 15 and 20 million refugees in Africa by the year 2000, only a decade away, from perhaps 200,000 in 1960. The question obviously is, why? What's happening? There are many answers to that, but there are 2 points to emphasize. First, this is no natural disaster. It is man-made. Second, we are involved. A major cause of refugees in Africa is environmental degradation. Many refugees are simply leaving a countryside that can no longer produce food. Why? Increasing population, drought, loss of vegetation due to overgrazing and the need for fuel wood, erosion, loss of topsoil. Then there are complex social and commercial factors. Small farmers are forced off their land by large-scale producers growing food for export. Western countries dump millions of tons of surplus food on the Third World, destroying markets and incentives for local farmers. We call it food aid. The film we're about to see, Fugitives in Africa, emphasizes war as a factor. Local and regional wars, often encouraged and supported by one or more industrialized countries, including the Soviet bloc. But military conflict and environmental degradation are both the result of action or non-action by governments in the Third World as well as the industrialized North. Though the majority of governments in the Third World call themselves non-aligned, virtually everyone is allied in some degree to one of the superpower camps. Development programs and local wars usually occur in the context of larger international scenarios in which the interests of Western countries confront those of the Soviet bloc. In other words, these are local wars. They're often surrogate wars in which West battles East by proxy, in microcosm, without getting their hands dirty. Sometimes it is West against West. Over the past 30 years, since the first moves towards independence, there has been constant conflict in Africa. The Belgian Congo, Nigeria, Uganda, the Western Sahara, Chad, Sudan, Ethiopia, Somalia, Mozambique, Namibia, Angola. Bitter, bloody wars, killing and maiming hundreds of thousands and uprooting millions. And virtually every conflict ultimately relates to a vested interest held by a northern industrialized nation or group of nations, who of course support their friends and oppose their enemies. So how are we involved in these things? Well, ask yourself, which would you prefer? A government in Chad allied to France, or one under the thumb of Colonel Muammar Gaddafi? The Soviet Navy in the ports of Somalia with direct access to the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf, or the American Navy? Ideally, of course, we'd have neither, but that's not the way the world works just yet. Like it or not, we have an interest, and ultimately our collective interest is expressed in the policies of our government and what it does in conjunction with other governments in the Third World. The irony is that while we can at least relate to these issues, the people in the film tonight, the victims, wouldn't know what we're talking about. 85% of Africa's refugees are from the countryside. Many have little concept of a border, much less a nation in the modern sense. And now their only social and political structures, family, tribe, and village, have been destroyed. And what do we do with these refugees in such numbers? They cannot go back. They cannot stay where they are. Many, of course, will die. Most will drift to the cities, where they will live in festering pools of humanity, slum and squatter settlements, rampant with disease and despair. In Black Africa in general, the cities are growing at twice the national population growth rates, and the slum and squatter settlements are growing at twice the rate of the cities themselves. UNICEF predicts that in the 25 years between 1975 and the year 2000, the urban population of Black Africa will have not doubled, but quadrupled, from about 60 million in 1975 to more than 250 million in 2000, barely a decade away. The vast majority of them will be poor, jobless, young, and understandably, very bitter.
Every man is born in one certain country, where he is at home with the smell of the soil and the feel of the wind. There his soul is free. There he will live and die, unless he is forced to flee, to become a fugitive. When internal violence in Europe, Asia, or Central America forces people to move, their plight makes world headlines. But in Africa, where the winds of change have blown for 20 years, it is an everyday event. A century ago, Europe imposed artificial borders within Africa. Today, those borders bleed with the comings and goings of people in search of sanctuary. Their story has been little told or little understood outside Africa, yet they account for 1/2 of the world population of refugees. There are 5 million of them. One of them, a highly educated and traveled Ethiopian, is Melkamu Adisu.
Do you know what it is to be a refugee? Well, I could tell you a little bit. I think being a refugee is something that is very difficult, first of all, to express to another person who is not, because it's an emotional and physical issue. When you're a refugee, you're unsettled emotionally. You do not belong to where you are, and you can't be where you belong. So it is a conflict within yourself.
Africa used to be known by outsiders for its mystery and its beauty. Now it is better known for its poverty, its wars, and above all, for its refugees. Millions of them escaping from national conflicts, tribal conflicts, and every kind of border dispute, many of them legacies from our colonial past. We have always had wars, often very fierce wars, but they were small wars, limited wars. And when they were over, we usually went home. We didn't create total devastation or thousands of refugees. The irony is that on one hand, our friends send us people and money to assist, resettle, and help us with our refugee problems. On the other hand, the same nations send us arms to sustain the conflict. Now we have your guns, your bombs, and your jets. We can kill each other in ever greater number and create refugees in millions as we fight over the borders you've left us.
The mother of this child and the father were trying to escape from the National Army. Now the woman happened to deliver. And then as soon as she delivered, she had a terrible bleeding. And then she felt helpless. Told the husband to take the baby and run with the baby. When the National Army came, they shot both parents and left the child there alive. The child was just lying the whole day. According to the information, the old woman who brought this child said the mother was shot just in the stomach. And the father, the head was completely off. They came to me and asked me to at least feed this baby on breast milk. And then I accepted and then decided to feed the baby until a week. They got a little bit of improvement. And then I decided to take over the child with me as my adopted child.
Over the last 10 years, the world's superpowers, East and West, have exported nearly $70,000 million worth of arms to Africa. In the same period, they provided 1/80th part of that sum to assist the refugees made homeless or worse by those arms. This is the human face of that traffic.
In this program, the refugees themselves will show you their problems, and we will do so in my host country, the Sudan. For here, you will find just about every problem, long-term and short-term, that faces both the refugees and the countries that befriend them. With 8 international frontiers, there is no shortage of people seeking asylum in the Sudan. They come from Chad, from Central Africa, from Zaire, from Uganda, and from my own homeland, Ethiopia.
Southern Sudan is one of the most troubled spots in Africa. Now beset with its own internal conflicts, its problems are compounded by a massive influx of refugees from Uganda, 200,000 people at the latest count. This is where their refugee experience begins officially, a few hundred yards from the border. A family arriving here on foot may have been on the move for months, but the world does not recognize them as refugees until they cross an international frontier. They arrive at this reception center, fatigued, diseased, and hungry. Here they will be embraced by the hospitality of their host country, Sudan, who has always maintained an open-door policy to refugees, despite its own problems, despite being one of the world's poorest nations. Here also they will learn to face one of modern Africa's paradoxes. The money to provide emergency food, drugs, and these tents has in many cases come from the same nations which also supplied the arms that caused them to flee in the first place. For the moment, international considerations are swept aside by the urgent needs of the refugees. These are attended to by officials from the Sudanese government and by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, the UNHCR. In this center alone, they may admit 400 or 500 people a day.
It is now maybe a year since these people were driven from their homes. Only a few have survived long enough to come into this Sudanese reception center. They have tried every other means of survival.
Mario Olima.
Mario Olima, his wife, and 6 children left their Ugandan farm 10 months ago. They tried to live with friends, but famine has made 2 of their children desperately ill. Their daughter is suffering from severe malnourishment. Her body has swollen up with fluid. The slightest touch is agonizing. She will probably die. And the parents will probably never see the other 4 children left in a border village.
Zaida Tiko. Alias Hassan. Asa Geria. Itakiru boy badu. Alias Asa Geria. Unita anejo. Nuru Nigai. Nuru Nigai. Sadia. Amidu mamu.
Once upon a time, in another country, these people were farmers. They had cattle, they had crops, they had families, and they had future. Now they live a suspended existence. They have lost control of their own destiny.
The first stop is a transit camp like this one, 50 miles from the border. Each was designed to provide food, water and shelter for 4,000. Many hold 8,000 puzzled and bewildered people who now have little hope of return to their homeland. The fight against disease and starvation begins here. Each person is examined and their condition is noted. But resources are slender. Here, the best diet available is skimmed milk, sugar and oil. It is not enough. Spiritual support is also available for the faithful. Paradoxically, it's a flourishing colonial heritage.
And the theme of today's Mass is just that God is love and forgiving. We can say only one thing, that God has got a plan for us. We cannot question God's ways. Maybe God is testing us how faithful in our love we are towards Him. He took bread and gave you thanks. He broke the bread, gave it to his disciples and said, "Take this, all of you, and eat it. This is my body, which will be given up for you. Take this, all of you, and drink from it. This is the cup of my blood, the blood of the true and everlasting covenant. It will be shed for you and for all men, so that sins may be forgiven. Do this in memory of me."
Death is a daily and familiar part of the new existence. Hundreds of miles from home, the dead are buried with all the remembered ritual they would have received there. For the mourners, It's the only familiar link with the past. Officially, over 200,000 refugees now live in southern Sudan, and probably twice as many have settled just inside her borders. Those who do register are herded together in 47 camps like this. Not only are there physical risks, epidemics of cholera and dysentery are frequent. Serious mental stress is a further problem. Any community under intense pressure will find scapegoats for its misfortunes. Long ago in Europe, we called them witches and killed them. In Africa, they call them poisoners. And here, too, they will be killed.
I saw stones flying all over the place, and many people shouting that she's a poisoner, she must be murdered. And the husband was protecting his wife, in the cause of which he had to sustain injuries too. They believe these people whom they call poisoners have a magical means of, passing the poison, or making you come into contact with the poison, such that you develop fevers, which can even kill you in a short time.
Aruna Taban was once a wealthy farmer who stayed at home after his family had fled. He felt that his age would protect him. He was wrong. Too late, he was forced to follow. The 11 days' walk to Sudan has crippled him, and on the way, he was robbed of his money and clothes. Now, he is no one and nothing, not even the will to live. In these huts, the international agencies make decisions affecting 200,000 people. Sjoerd van Schooneveld leads the UNHCR team.
Shelter is number one. To get more or less clean water for refugees is the second problem. Of course, the always existing problem is food. The food given in the southern Sudan is not all that much. We give rice at the moment, and we give cooking oil, beans if they are available, and milk powder. At the moment we don't have beans because the transport is not easy to solve this problem. So the refugees live on a ration that's insufficient.
And the international agencies come up against another major problem common to any community where the disadvantaged live cheek by jowl with long-term residents. The problem is jealousy. Medical care is just one example.
Our problem here is that we want to help refugees, and we see that the Sudanese need a lot of assistance themselves. So this touches to the whole problem of what UNHCR policy should be, whether we have to help refugees, so we only improve the spots where refugees are, or whether we help to make the infrastructure of the whole area better. And I personally think that we should do this in southern Sudan. It creates a lot of jealousy between the newcomers, the refugees, and the people living here. If we are handing out things that the Southern Sudanese don't have, and if the healthcare in the refugee dispensaries is much better than in the other dispensaries for Sudanese.
Up to this point, the refugee has been chiefly concerned with safety and survival. Now he must face up to a second major crisis, the long-term future for himself and his family. Sudan is much poorer than his own country. He cannot expect his accustomed standard of living, either now or in the future. The more enterprising make the most of it. Here, for instance, the newcomers have taught their Sudanese neighbors how to decontaminate their water supplies. The project, paid for by international donation, benefits both host and guest. Once the needs of the locals have also been met, it is easy to establish good relations. The refugees' leader was once a headmaster in Uganda. Now, every week, he reports back to the local villagers.
I am thankful that our dispensary is almost finished. And the store there, which is built for refugees, is also almost finished. All our services here are to be integrated, and when we leave for Uganda, they will be of your own use.
If and when they do ever leave for home, they will leave behind vast tracts of land converted to arable usage. The local Sudanese chief hands over some of his hunting land, and the UNHCR provides the tools to clear the ground and build a house. For the first year, they will also supply basic food. Then seeds are provided to raise next year's crops, and theoretically, the refugee family is on its own. The policy is called self-reliance, but it doesn't always work. If the seeds arrive before the tools, hungry people will eat whatever they can. Today's needs are more pressing than tomorrow's policies. But it can be made to work, not least because the local people remember a time when the situation was reversed.
Why? Because we have experienced at the time when we were also refugees in Uganda, and we know how conditions of refugees prevails.
I would
like to tell you a story in English that when there are two elephants fighting, you find that it is the grass which is going to be crushed. That's why the refugees themselves, they know very well that they are really suffering, and they've suffered enough, and they've come here to save their lives.
The need for peaceful coexistence is recognized by all at local level, and if the international community wants further proof, it need look no further than the problems of transport and communication. Unless these primitive mud tracks are maintained, at least during the dry season, the precious supplies of food, tools and seed cannot be delivered. And without that, the whole UNHCR policy of self-reliance will fail. Furthermore, with up to 1,000 refugees arriving each day, a new settlement is needed every single week. But to open up this valley, you need a new road. In the tradition of African hospitality, the local huntsmen raise no objection. Reservations about the road are more likely to come from international donor countries, always fearful that the refugees and the money which follows them will come to represent an economic resource to the host country. Sudan, on the other hand, considers that by opening her borders to all in need of refuge, she is already the major donor country, deserving all the help she can get. Meanwhile, the road stops here, unless international aid is forthcoming to shorten the supply route by 80 miles by building a bridge over this river. It might never be built unless the mutual needs of refugee and host are internationally recognized.
In southern Sudan, the refugees and the Sudanese have three major things going for them. Firstly, they are both from closely related tribes. The bonds of kith and kin are always stronger than an international boundary. Secondly, the local Sudanese themselves have had experience of being refugees in Uganda. They know what it feels like. Thirdly, because there is no shortage of fertile land, self-reliance for the refugee is possible. Given a lot of hard work, he will succeed. Only in the field of education can the refugee feel that he has been denied his rights.
Our arrival in the school and the interviews that we took were successful. But then we were turned out as unwanted or illegal students in the school.
We are asking the high authorities, at least if they can get us some vacancies, to take at least half of us for further studies, so that in the future they promote a good nation for the young generations.
That typically African desire for education may well lead some people to turn their backs on life as peasant farmers and to flee their settlement. It is then that the full insecurity of refugee status hits them, for there is only one direction in which they can go, towards the towns and cities of their host country, in the search for a future that resembles their past.
This move is not welcomed by the authorities. The authorities mostly don't want the refugees in the city because they cannot provide services and health care and housing for them. But the stronger will wins, and this is the result. In Port Sudan, the population of refugees has grown to about 60,000, and that is 1 in 5 of the whole population of the city.
There is no sanitation, no running water. You buy your space to live, you buy your water, and you buy your own disease. It would be simple to avoid fresh water, decent sewage, but our host country cannot afford it, nor can we. Out of 60,000 refugees in Port Sudan, 3,000 can look forward to this new housing. It is hoped that each compound will contain only 2 families. It is certain that each will have running water and drains. But will these gardens bear crops, or will they be filled with more shanty dwellings, more refugees? And why do our benefactors give us reject asbestos roofing?
The refugee's memory is scarred with violence, and the impetus that first drove him from his homeland will make him constantly restless, moving again and again in search of a peaceful existence. He may even reach Khartoum, the capital city of the urban refugee. Here, despite official disapproval, he will gravitate to recognized refugee ghettos, and now his relationship with his host country begins to break down, for Khartoum is crowded and poor, newcomer and citizen are in direct competition for jobs, houses, and medical facilities. Father Charles is the unofficial chaplain to thousands of refugee slum dwellers.
The problem of surviving, of living, first of all, they must find a house. So many times they are faced with paying extra, you know, I mean, to pay very high rents of the house. Even houses that the Sudanese would not take, they are compelled to take it. So during the winter, they haven't got blankets, at least one blanket, you know, during the nights it is rather cold. Then food is also expensive, especially if one hasn't got any work. You must go begging here and there. And the problem of the school for their children, you know, their children don't know enough Arabic to join the government schools. We started, first of all, a primary school. We put some benches under some trees, and then we collected 3 teachers. Then we had to expand until we got to nearly 500 children. But we couldn't, you know, carry on because we had no permission for the school. I applied through the Sudan Council of Churches also to a government, you know, office. And of course there was no any reply because the policy of the government is to keep refugees out of the capital if possible. So we decided with the bishop to take a permission from God and to go on for that year. And it was the year of the child. And then the security came and complained. Why did we start a school without permission and so on? So I said, well, this is the year of the child. We'd like to do something. And if possible, please let us go on until the end of the school year. They were very kind. They said, right, until the end of the school year, we should not interfere. But afterwards, you must definitely stop, and that's it.
I might have good news for you, because I got some application forms from a university somewhere. Yeah?
Some will be lucky. They will go to another country to study, maybe even to live.
Wonderful. Last week I got some application forms. You might be interested. They are sent by our regional office in Dakar, Senegal, and they're for the University of Nigeria.
The UNHCR headquarters in Khartoum is the mecca of hope for many of my countrymen. They wait for days and weeks for an interview. And while he waits, he must learn to live without rights, without identity, and without self-respect. They have not yet realized their fate. They are refugees. No matter where they settle, they will sooner or later become restless again.
All this year? What are the reasons that made you flee your country? Precisely, dates, what happened to you? Okay.
A lucky few will go to Europe or America. But is it a durable solution? From my own experience, it is not. There is only one way to stop being a refugee. It is to go home. And that may not be for a long time. The refugees from my homeland, Ethiopia, are very different people from the local Sudanese. They have been caught up in a long internal conflict, made worse by the self-interest of the superpowers. Those conflicts might have ended if it hadn't been for that outside interference. So today, there are 500,000 refugees living in eastern Sudan. Many of them have been here for more than 10 years.
Ethiopia and eastern Sudan share 3,000 miles of border. Officially, 1 in 7 of eastern Sudan's population is a refugee, living in 25 settlement camps. Many more are unofficial residents of border villages and towns. A whole population is in flight. They come overland through the mountains, slowly and painfully. The country they arrive in is very different from their homeland. An eroded landscape greets them. Livestock and people find survival difficult, but they have no choice. They know what will happen if they turn back.
تي غزاوتي تي رصاص قيلهم بتانك غيرهم أنا أبتقى مجدي تدكوانا تزنبري حجبوا حلفوا نتخصوا سب إن هرموا قتلوهم بعيني وين بفنسترا غير يريهم ها نيري مش من طوال أي أبتجازة تعزية خلوا حجي بزي رصاص بزخ أجزاوتي ينددري برصاص غيرهم تي أقدر يهرموه حودت زوجتي مندوق نصم زي هرموز نور بقى جزاوتي يندد كابر أساس أنت دحنكون إذا جزاوتي يندد ولا تحوخ مطعني إليه ليتخلوا كهذا قص حديري تبلا نجهو كده اليوم قالوتي سجوجة أنا خا دحريم وزي.
The problem is going to continue as long as the foreign friends that we have are interested in keeping their own interests going by backing one group against the other, by aggressively selling arms to those who need to buy bread, by disregarding true humanitarian goals. But you can say, why don't you refuse to buy arms if you need bread? I say to you, from my experience of when you were in my land, I need to defend myself from my brother. Remember, the way you divided up our land has something to do with my not trusting him.
That mistrust is part of the refugee experience. Mistrust not only of those who once sought to destroy, but also those who seek to help.
نائلة مجبو كهبة لعلة أنا لو بتأمية حريرو عندي تأثيرو بعرق عن بنفس بماي موقع بقري بحار ناتلبلبة أبران داز ولا كم جود في بيت ناود أقل زللي زنا جرزي أي مسكت خم بدم بي تملكيتو زنا جرزي بفلاي لا مالتنا سدتني تفايل زقامة درجة ساعات هنا مثلا كم سدتني تات كم سرعة حاول كحزم تنعتم تفايل زمت جنزب بقت تعتم كوعلكم زلوي.
The UNHCR set up this temporary center to deal with an unexpected influx of people from Ethiopia. They were driven both by drought and a new decree on military service. The only person available to administer the center was a young volunteer, Tim Dawson.
This morning we've registered 70 cases. We've only got money for 30 people. This is nothing new. We've had this problem before. And one day we'd have 15 people. Next day 80 people turn up. Because we don't know they're coming, we can't prepare. Last week, the same thing happened. We suddenly had 80 people after one day. There's been a recent declaration that everybody over the age of 18 could be called for national service for 2 years or more. So this is coming sort of the last straw to them, you know. They're fed up with the education system and policies of the government. So this is sort of the final thing, and they're coming now. Because there's no help beyond the money or the feeding at the moment. Once they're in here, we register them, we give them £5, £10, and say, you're on your own. If they're sick, we can refer them to the clinic. As far as accommodation goes, they're on their own. Employment, they're on their own.
From that reception center, they could go to any one of 25 permanent settlements in eastern Sudan. From a distance, they all look similar, but each one has its own problems, and the quality of life in each ranges from hopeful to downright despair. Rakuba, for instance, has plenty of arable land for crops, but it suffers from water problems. Every May, the driest month, the springs dry up. They have bored for water and found enough for the whole district, but they cannot find a pump strong enough to bring it to the surface. The July rains will bring water, so much of it that Rakuba will be cut off from its much-needed supplies of tools and seeds. And so, using their own labor and funds from the UNHCR, the refugees are building a bridge. Once a pump has been found, Umrakuba and its inhabitants might well be self-sufficient.
Tawawa refugee settlement on the edge of the eastern Sudanese town of Gedaref. Here, there is no land to spare for the refugees. Even generous Sudan has no land to give away. There is little enough for their own people. There is no chance of the refugee resuming his old life. Here, all he can do is hire out his labor to others, and usually at a very low wage. Anyway, many of the Ethiopians were townspeople, often educated students and businessmen. They see no future for themselves as landless peasants in a foreign country. They are often very aware of the political situation. Their very existence as refugees began as a political protest.
አሁን ግን መጥተን ያልሆኑት ስናይ እኛ በእኛ የኛ ወንድሞቻችን ሲገሏቸው አንደኛ ነገር ደግሞ እኛ ሴት አዳሪዎች ብለን ቤት ከፍተን ስንቀመጣለን ቤት ከፍተን በመቀመጣችን ቀን ስንሰራው የዋልነውን ስራችንን ማታ ለማንም ወንበዴ ነው የምናቀብለው ያለ ካራ ይዘው አሳድሩን ብለው እኛ ለገንዘብ ተታለን ወንዶች ስናሳድራቸው በነፍሳችን ተጫውተው በገንዘባችን ተጫውተውብን ነው የሚሄዱት
እና ይሄ ስራ ለምን ሽርሙጥና ፈላሽ
ማማ ምንም የለም ዝም ብዬ ነው የምሸርሙጥ ማለት ነው ዝም ብዬ ነው የምሸርሙጥ ያለሁት ሰው ያረጋው ብዬ ነው እንጂ ሌላ የለም
ጥቅም ታገኙበታለሽ አሁን ልጆች የሚያስተምሩ
የለም ልጆች ዝም ብለው እንዳያድሩ ብዬ ነው እንጂ ችግር ሆነና
ምን ችግር ይገጥምሻል በዚህ ስራ ላይ ሳለሽ
መቼስ ከወንድ ምናምን ከተጋሰሰው ያመኛል ስንት ችግር ያገኛል ጤና የለኝም መቼ ችግር ስለሆነ የምሰራ ስላጣሁት አሁን ይሁን ያልኩት ያካሄዳለ ማለት ነው
ስለናገር ያለሽ ሴት አዳሪ ተደስታ አታርም አንድ ቃላት ድማ ነፍሷን ለማዳን አንድ ቃላት ስትናገር ድማ ጨለማ ለብሰው ጨለማ ተንተርሰው እሳት ነው የሚለቁብን ያለው የ25 ሳንቲም ወይንም ድማ እንበለው በዚህ ሀገር የ50 ሳንቲም ክብሪት ምንም ማችን አይደለም ወይም ጋዝ ምናችን አይደለም ይያሉ ጋዝ ሲለቁብን ነው የሚያሩ
With no land, no employment, no turning back, no going forward, the only hope in Tawawa is the workshop. Here, university professors work side by side with peasant farmers. They print T-shirts for the agencies, they make soap, and the men even take up the traditional pursuits of their womenfolk, spinning yarn and with it weaving rugs. For there is no such thing as pride when survival is at stake. Indeed, centuries-old social traditions are overturned by the refugee experience. Those traditions belong to another time, another place. The dream country of freedom, contentment, the homeland. A place to return to.
Kilo 26 is the kind of place we dread, a living death, a place where no communication, no future seems possible. The camp is empty of food, of water, of human spirit. This is what it is to have no roots, no hope. This is what it is to be a refugee.
I don't think anyone who has never been a refugee can ever know what it is like. The first crisis is emotional. Probably, for the first time, you find yourself in a place where you know you don't belong. You don't understand the culture, the language, you don't like the food, and you probably realize that you are despised. You are a second-class citizen. When it really hits you that this is the situation, you begin to wonder if it's worthwhile. Perhaps it is better to go home and die.
أنا نحوار نعدي خيد كلكم معلت خنقركم يعني وعيل حادير نعدي زي ملس سبيلا نعدي ملس حاد قل علنا بعدي سلة تباري رزم صاخو أبجي خاء مدر وحيتني
A widow left to care for a young family. A merchant who wants nothing more than the chance to start again. These are the displaced people. My people. And the world's orphans. There is a stage in being a refugee when you suddenly realize that it is not all going to go away like a bad dream. You're going to be a refugee for the long time. Perhaps for the rest of your life, you may never go home. Particularly if you're young, 16, 18, or 20, you've got to have something to do. It is the same in Africa as it is in the West. And when you don't have anything to do, you can't be productive in any way. You have no control over your own future, your own life. Then all of a sudden, you realize that tomorrow is going to be just like today, except that you will be older and probably sicker. And all these things you had dreams of, education, a good job, home and a family, all of this is not for you. You are a refugee. It is easy then to become very bitter, to become angry about the situation that made you a refugee, angry because no one is helping you, angry because you can see your life being spent in camps, angry because you know you have only one life and you do not want to spend it like this. Somehow, you are no longer part of the world, the living world. You are somehow outside it. Your life has stopped. Perhaps it is over.
سام قداي قدا خيبل حموم يحوي قدا مقبي سيني إذا تريد الله أنت دايبل أي حوي هجي أنا حانت تحلف كويس في الليل تعبا خلاص سمعها كم يلكات دار باللي نقر
Dawid Wari never went home. 6 months later, he died in exile.
There is another dimension to this refugee story that is often overlooked. For every child that dies of malnutrition or disease, hundreds of those that survive are badly damaged. We know that malnutrition causes not just physical defects and illness, but mental deficiencies. Lack of protein affects brain growth and structure. Psychological stress can lead to emotional illness. Malnutrition and stress are creating in the third world hundreds of millions of youngsters who are physically, mentally, and emotionally disabled to some degree. To deal with the refugee problem in Africa, we must look beyond the specific events that, at least superficially, produce the refugee. We must look at the underlying structures that produce those events, the economic, social, and political practices that prevail today. This is not a problem that can be solved simply by more money. More money, too often, reinforces the status quo. Next week, Cross Currents provides a rare glimpse into a little-known, rather strange war in the Western Sahara, where the Polisario are fighting Morocco for the independence of their bleak, desolate homeland. It may be the last major war of liberation in this century. Here's a preview of War in the Desert.
Constantly wary of air attack, they speed across the desert in Land Rovers, patrolling the thin strip of Western Sahara the Moroccans have left them. They call it the Liberated Zone. Cluster bomb casings are a reminder that the Moroccans control the skies. Air attack has also driven the Polisario underground. To maintain their credibility as a government with territory, they claim to administer the liberated zone from these bunkers. Estimates of Polisario's strength vary from 7,000 to 20,000, but they tie down some 150,000 Moroccan soldiers, hoping to win the war by attrition. Occasionally, they launch dawn attacks to overrun the wall and take prisoners. New recruits learn the tactics in live ammunition exercises on a mock-up of the wall. But they can no longer seriously penetrate Morocco's defenses.
War in the Desert, next week on Cross Currents. A reminder about the viewer's guides we've prepared for this series. They offer additional background information on each of the subjects we've covered. There's also a list of suggested reading in each guide. I think you'll find them worthwhile. For Cross Currents, I'm Jim Carney. Good night.
Viewer's guides for each program in the Cross Currents series are available at a cost of $2 each, or $15 for the full set of 10. You can obtain your guides by writing to The Knowledge Bookstore, Post Office Box 94,000, Richmond, BC, V6Y2A2. If you prefer, you can phone the bookstore at one of these numbers, 660-2190, or toll-free, 1-800-663-9711. And you can charge the order to your Visa or MasterCard. Once again, the cost of these informative guides is $2 each, or $15 for the set of 10. Order yours now.